At 3:42 a.m. on December 21, 1944, Technical Sergeant Arthur "Artie" Finch sat in a frozen depression in the earth outside Bastogne, Belgium, trying to remember what heat felt like. His boots, frozen solid, had effectively become blocks of ice encasing feet he hadn't felt in 4 days. But the cold wasn't the primary concern. The concern was the terrifying rhythmic sound of tank treads grinding against the hard-packed snow 300 yards to the north, hidden behind a curtain of impenetrable fog and the dark silhouettes of the Ardennes forest. The 101st Airborne Division was surrounded. 7 German divisions had encircled the town, cutting off all supply lines, medical evacuations, and reinforcements. In the previous 72 hours, the temperature had dropped to 6 degrees below zero. The plasma bottles carried by the medics had frozen and burst. The morphine syrettes had to be kept in armpits to remain liquid, and Artie Finch, a 25-year-old platoon sergeant from the gritty industrial sector of Chicago, was holding a defensive line with 11 men, 4 rifles and a single M2 60-meter mortar that had just become the most useless piece of steel in Belgium. Finch's M2 mortar sat in a pit, dug frantically into the frozen ground. It was a simple weapon, a smoothbore tube, a baseplate and a bipod. According to the field manual 2385, it was capable of dropping a 3-pound high-explosive shell onto a target at 1,800 yards with reasonable accuracy. But the field manual had been written in sunny Georgia by officers who had never tried to fight a war in a meat locker. The problem wasn't the tube, it was the snow. 4 feet of fresh, powder-soft snow had blanketed the Bois Jacques. When a standard mortar shell impacted, the point-detonating fuse, designed to trigger upon hitting hard ground, simply plunged into the deep drift. The snow cushioned the impact just enough to prevent the firing pin from striking the primer. Or, if it did detonate, the explosion happened 4 feet underground, muffling the shrapnel and turning a lethal weapon into a harmless, muffled thump that the Germans laughed at. Finch knew this because he had watched it happen. 6 hours earlier, a German patrol had probed their lines. Finch had ordered 3 rounds fired, 3 rounds went out, 3 rounds landed, 0 rounds detonated effectively. 1 was a complete dud, the other 2 buried themselves so deep that the explosion merely kicked up a geyser of white powder, leaving the German infantry completely unharmed. Beside him in the foxhole lay Private First Class Daniel "Danny" O'Malley, a 19-year-old kid from Brooklyn who still had the softness of civilian life in his eyes. Danny was the radio man, shivering violently under a thin wool blanket that had stiffened with frost. "Sarge," Danny whispered, his teeth chattering with a sound like dice in a cup. "Lieutenant Thorne says we gotta conserve ammo. Says HQ is tracking every round." Finch looked at the kid, then at the M1 carbine resting on his own lap. "HQ isn't here, Danny. HQ is probably drinking coffee in a tent in France. We aren't conserving ammo because they told us to. We're conserving it because it doesn't work." Arthur Finch wasn't a career soldier. Before the war, he had been a foreman in a sprawling scrap metal yard on the south side of Chicago. He had spent his teenage years dismantling heavy machinery, learning the difference between what an engineering schematic said a machine could do and what it could actually do when you took a wrench and a sledgehammer to it. He understood metal stress, tolerances, and the fluid dynamics of combustion better than he understood military protocol. He knew that machines were suggestions, not laws. But the United States Army disagreed. At 06 hours, the sun failed to rise. Instead, the sky lightened into a oppressive, milky gray that offered no warmth, only visibility, and with the light came the 8th German assault. It started not with a scream, but with the snap of twigs. The Germans were wearing white camouflage smocks, rendering them invisible against the snowdrifts until they were less than 200 yards away. A wave of infantry, supported by the terrifying grinding of a Panzer IV tank, emerged from the tree line. "Contact front," Corporal Silas Vance shouted from the adjacent foxhole. Vance was 29, a former oil rigger from Tulsa who looked 40. He was the only other man in the platoon who understood that they were in trouble deeper than the snow. Finch grabbed the radio handset from Danny. "Blue 6, this is Blue 2. We have armor and infantry advancing. Coordinate grid 44-9. Requesting artillery." The voice on the other end was static, filled, and apologetic. "Blue 2, negative on artillery. Tubes are dry, you are on your own. Hold the line." "Hold the line." The phrase was a death sentence. "Mortar!" Finch yelled. scrambling toward the tube. "Vance, hang the rounds! We need to break up that infantry!" Vance grabbed a shell, pulled the safety pin, and dropped it down the tube. Thunk. Whoosh. The round soared in a high arc, disappearing into the grey fog. Finch counted the seconds, flight time calculated by instinct. It should have impacted right in the center of the advancing white shapes. They waited for the crack of the explosion. They waited for the scream of shrapnel. Instead, they heard a muffled ft, a sound like someone punching a pillow. A plume of snow erupted harmlessly 50 yards ahead of the Germans. The enemy soldiers didn't even flinch. They kept moving, their MP-40 submachine guns chattering, cutting through the branches above the Americans' heads. "Drop another, walk it back," Finch screamed. Vance fired again and again. Puffed, puffed. The rounds were burying themselves. The fuse sensitivity was set for soil, for mud, for pavement. It wasn't calibrated for a 4-foot cushion of Belgian winter. The Germans realized the American fire support was impotent. They stopped taking cover and started sprinting. "They're not stopping!" Danny screamed, rising up to aim his rifle. "Sarge, there!" The single crack of a Mauser rifle cut through the chaotic noise. It was a precise surgical sound. Danny O'Malley snapped backward, as if yanked by an invisible rope. He hit the bottom of the foxhole, clutching his throat. The blood was impossibly red against the dirty white snow at the bottom of the pit. It steamed in the freezing air. Finch dropped to his knees, his hands instantly slick with Danny's blood, trying to apply pressure. "Medic! I need a medic up here!" But there were no medics. The closest corpsman was pinned down in the next sector. Finch watched the light fade from the kid's eyes in less than 90 seconds. Danny tried to say something, maybe a name, maybe a prayer, but all that came out was a gurgling bubble of red. Then he was gone. The German assault was repelled only by desperate small arms fire and the sheer stubbornness of the paratroopers, but the cost had been paid. The enemy had pulled back to regroup, knowing now that the American heavy weapons were useless. They would be back, and next time, they wouldn't stop at the perimeter. At 0930 hours, Finch stormed into the command post, a log-covered dugout distinct only because it had a map table. Lieutenant Julian Thorne stood over the map, looking impeccable despite the filth around him. Thorne was 23, a Harvard man, an officer who treated the Army regulations like holy scripture. "We lost O'Malley," Finch said, his voice flat. His hands still stained with dried blood he hadn't had water to wash off. Thorne didn't look up. "I heard, Sergeant. It's a tragedy. Make sure his personal effects are gathered." "It wasn't a tragedy, Lieutenant. It was a mechanical failure. The mortars are duds. The snow is catching them like a catcher's mitt. We need to fuse them for airbursts or graze action, or we need to retreat to the ridgeline where the ground is windswept." Thorne finally looked up, his face pale and pinched with the stress of command he wasn't ready for. "There will be no retreat, Sergeant. The General said nuts to the surrender ultimatum. We hold. As for the mortars, we use standard issue ammunition. We do not tamper with ordnance." "The ordnance isn't working, sir." Finch stepped closer, invading the officer's personal space. "If we file down the shear wires on the M52 fuses, we can make them sensitive enough to detonate on tree branches. We turn the forest into shrapnel. We get air bursts." Thorne's eyes widened. "That is absolutely forbidden. You're talking about modifying a live explosive device in the field. If you weaken the shear wire, a strong gust of wind or a clumsy loader could detonate the round in the tube. You'd kill your own squad." "If I don't do it, the Germans will kill my squad by sundown." Finch slammed his fist on the map table. "We need effective fire. I can make these rounds work. I did this kind of thing with heavy machinery in Chicago. It's just tension mechanics." "You are not in Chicago, Sergeant. You are in the United States Army." Thorne straightened his helmet. "You are strictly forbidden from altering government property, especially high explosives. If you touch those fuses, I will have you court-martialed for reckless endangerment. Is that clear?" Finch stared at the lieutenant. He saw a man paralyzed by the book, a man who would rather die correctly than survive by breaking a rule. "Crystal clear, sir," Finch lied. He walked out of the CP and back into the biting cold. The snow was falling again, soft and silent, covering the blood in Danny's foxhole. Finch looked at the M2 mortar tube, cold and indifferent steel. He looked at the crate of yellow-painted shells. He thought of Danny O'Malley bleeding out because a 3-pound bomb had failed to explode. He thought of the Germans regrouping, likely bringing up more armor for a dusk attack. He found Corporal Vance sitting on an ammo crate, smoking a cigarette he had rolled from tobacco found in a dead German's pocket. "Thorne say yes?" Vance asked, though he already knew the answer. "Thorne said he'd court-martial me," Finch said, crouching down and popping the lid off a fresh crate of mortar shells. He pulled out a combat knife and a small metal file he kept in his boot, a tool from his old life, a tool for fixing things that were broken. Vance watched him. He looked at the knife, then at the live round in Finch's hand. "You know, if you file that shear wire too thin, the G-force of the launch will set it off right above our heads. We'll be pink mist, Artie." "The wire is brass, Silas," Finch said quietly, examining the nose of the mortar shell. "Standard shear strength is designed to punch through a roof. I don't need it to punch through a roof. I need it to tickle a pine branch and blow hell down on top of them." He began to scrape the metal. It was a delicate, terrifying surgery. One slip, one spark, one heavy-handed stroke, and he would lose his hands, or his life. But his hands, calloused from years of wrestling scrap iron in the freezing Chicago winters, were steady. "They killed Danny," Finch whispered, the file rasping softly against the brass pin. "They don't get to kill anyone else." "We're going to need more range if we want to hit their staging area," Vance said, leaning in, complicit now. "The tube won't take the pressure of an extra charge." "The tube is rated for safety," Finch muttered, blowing metal shavings off the fuse. "We don't need safety. We need physics. Go get me the communication wire and a bucket of water. We're going to ice jacket the barrel." "Ice jacket?" "We wrap the barrel in wire, pack it with mud and snow, and let it freeze solid. It'll reinforce the steel hoop stress. Then we can double charge the propellant." Vance stared at him. It was madness. It was engineering heresy. It was a court-martial offense on 3 different counts. "If Thorne sees this," Vance started. "Thorne isn't looking," Finch said, his eyes hard. "Thorne is looking at a map. We're looking at the enemy." The sun began to dip lower, signaling the approach of the long winter night. The Germans were out there preparing the 9th assault. They expected the Americans to be frozen, starving, and armed with dud weapons. They had no idea that in a hole in the Bois Jacques, a scrapyard foreman was currently dismantling the safety regulations of the U.S. Army, one filing stroke at a time. Finch finished the first round and set it aside. It looked identical to a standard round, but now it was a hair-triggered death trap. He picked up the second one. "Get the wire, Silas," Finch ordered. "We have work to do." The sun set at 4:30 p.m., plunging the Bois Jacques into a darkness so absolute it felt physical, like a heavy, suffocating blanket of black wool. But in the foxhole, there was a different kind of darkness, the darkness of calculated risk. For 3 hours, Artie Finch and Silas Vance had been engaged in an act of engineering heresy that would have horrified any ordnance officer in the United States Army. They were manufacturing a bomb that was just as likely to kill them as it was the Germans. The ice jacket was complete. It was an ugly, primitive thing. Finch had taken the standard steel tube of the M2 mortar and wrapped it tightly in spiraled communication wire, binding it with the tension of a suspension bridge cable. Over the wire, they had packed a slurry of mud and snow, dousing it repeatedly with water from their canteens. In the sub-zero temperatures, the mixture had frozen instantly, encasing the barrel in a rock-hard composite shell of ice, earth, and steel wire. It looked less like a weapon of war and more like a frozen tree stump, unrecognizable and grotesque. "It's ugly as sin, Artie," Vance whispered, blowing into his cupped hands to keep his fingers from turning gangrenous. "You really think that ice is going to hold the pressure of a double charge?" Finch ran his hand over the frozen casing. It was smooth, cold, and solid. "It's hoop stress, Silas. The wire takes the tension. The ice distributes the shock. In the scrapyard, we used to patch burst hydraulic pipes with wet concrete and wire mesh until the replacement parts came in. It held 3,000 psi. This tube only needs to hold 2,000. "And if it doesn't?" Vance asked, looking at the supercharge rounds they had prepared, standard mortar shells with extra increments of propellant powder scavenged from discarded German rounds found in the woods. "Then we won't have to worry about the cold anymore," Finch said grimly. Around them, the platoon was shivering, their morale brittle as icicles. They had heard the rumors. They knew the lieutenant had forbidden the use of heavy weapons to conserve ammo, a euphemism for "we are going to die here." They watched Finch and Vance working in the dark, not understanding the science, but sensing the desperation. At 19 hard hours, the forest to the north came alive. It wasn't the stealthy approach of infantry this time, it was the roar of engines. The Germans, emboldened by the American lack of response earlier that day, were dispensing with subtlety. They were launching a mechanized assault directly up the logging road, led by 2 half-tracks and a Panzer IV, with infantry swarming behind them like white ghosts. "Stand to! Stand to!" Lieutenant Thorne's voice cracked over the shouting, thin and frantic. "Hold your fire until you see the whites of their eyes. No premature shooting." Thorne scrambled into the command pit, clutching his binoculars, though they were useless in the dark. He was trying to command a battle from a manual that didn't exist. He didn't see the tactical reality. He only saw the terrified faces of his men and the dwindling supply counts. Finch ignored him. He looked at Vance. "Load the hair trigger." This was the first test. The hair trigger rounds were the ones Finch had filed down earlier, the safety shear wires reduced to a thickness of paper. If Vance dropped the round too hard, or if it clipped the side of the tube on the way down, it would detonate instantly, vaporizing them both. Vance picked up the modified shell. His hands were shaking, not just from the cold now. He looked at the fuse, then at Finch. Finch nodded once. A silent pact. Vance guided the shell into the mouth of the ice-jacketed tube. He didn't drop it. He slid it, agonizingly gentle, until gravity took over. He pulled his hands back as if the tube were a striking cobra. The sound was different. The frozen mud jacket dampened the metallic ring of the tube, but the extra propellant made the launch report sharper, a violent snap that echoed through the trees. "Misfire! Who authorized fire?" Thorne screamed from 20 yards away. Finch didn't answer. He was counting. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi. The shell arched high into the black sky, invisible. It began its descent toward the advancing German line. A standard round would have buried itself in the 4 feet of powder snow, exploding harmlessly underground. But this wasn't a standard round. The shell fell through the canopy of the pine forest. The instant the sensitive fuse brushed against a pine branch, a trigger no heavier than a bird landing, it detonated. It wasn't a muffled thump. It was a thunderclap 30 feet above the ground. The explosion shredded the treetops, sending a lethal rain of wood splinters and red-hot shrapnel plunging downward into the exposed German infantry. Because it was an airburst, the snow offered no protection. The foxholes offered no cover from above. Screams erupted from the darkness. Terrified, confused screams. The Germans had been laughing at the American duds all day. Now the forest itself was attacking them. "Hit him again!" Finch roared, the adrenaline flooding his veins like liquid fire. "Elevation 60, rapid fire!" Vance grabbed another modified shell, then another. The rhythm took over. Drop, crack, boom, drop, crack, boom. The effects were devastating. 3 airbursts in 10 seconds. The tree line ahead of them turned into a meat grinder. The German infantry, who had been advancing with confidence, were suddenly pinned down by a weapon they couldn't understand. They were taking casualties from above, forcing them to dive into the snow, which slowed their advance to a crawl. "Cease fire! Cease fire immediately!" Lieutenant Thorne stumbled into their position, his face a mask of fury and confusion. "Sergeant Finch, you are firing unauthorized ordnance. You are revealing our position." "I'm revealing that we aren't dead yet, sir," Finch yelled back, not stopping. "Vance, 2 degrees right. They're shifting to the road." "I gave you a direct order." Thorne grabbed Finch's shoulder. Finch spun around, knocking the officer's hand away. "Look downrange, Lieutenant. Look." Thorne froze. He looked. Through the gaps in the trees, illuminated by the flashes of the airbursts, he saw the German infantry retreating. They were dragging their wounded, scrambling back toward the safety of the armor. The assault had broken before it even reached the American perimeter. For a moment, there was silence save for the moans of the wounded in the distance and the ringing in their ears. Thorne stared at the mortar tube. He saw the wire. He saw the mud. He saw the file marks on the remaining shells in the crate. "You modified the fuses," Thorne whispered, the reality of the violation sinking in. "And the barrel. My God, Finch, you've compromised the structural integrity of the only support weapon we have. If that ice melts, or if the wire snaps—" "It won't melt, sir. It's 10 below zero," Finch said, his voice cold. "And the wire is from the communication line you weren't using because the radios are dead." Thorne looked at him, his mouth opening and closing. He was witnessing a miracle of improvisation, but his mind was stuck on the court-martial offenses. This is reckless endangerment. You've risked the lives of this entire squad." I just saved the lives of this entire squad. Finch stepped closer, looming over the smaller officer. Danny O'Malley is dead because we followed the manual. Those Germans out there are retreating because we didn't. You want to court-martial me? Fine. Put me in the brig, but do it after we win. Right now, get out of my foxhole so I can reload. The confrontation was cut short by a new sound. A deep, mechanical growl. The German Panzer IV hadn't retreated. It had stopped at the edge of the clearing, 600 yards out, well beyond the effective range of a standard 60mm mortar, especially one fighting an uphill trajectory. The tank commander knew the American mortars couldn't reach him. He began to traverse his turret, aiming his 75mm cannon directly at their position. "Tank!" Vance yelled. "He's ranging us! We gotta move!" "No," Finch said. He looked at the ice-jacketed tube. "We don't move. We reach out and touch him." "It's 600 yards, Artie," Vance hissed. "With this elevation, you'd need a charge 4, maybe 5. The tube will blow." "The tube is reinforced," Finch said, though he felt a knot of fear tighten in his stomach. "Give me the supercharge, the one with the German powder." Thorne watched, paralyzed. He knew he should stop them. He knew that putting unknown enemy propellant into an American weapon was suicide. But he also saw the tank's muzzle flash as it fired a sighting shot that shattered a tree 20 yards to their left. The next shot would kill them all. Finch took the supercharge round. He had taped 3 extra bags of propellant to the tail fins. It was a monstrosity of ballistics. "Clear the pit," Finch ordered. "Everyone get back." He didn't want Vance near it. If the tube burst, the shrapnel from the barrel would act like a grenade. Finch straddled the frozen weapon alone. He was betting his life on his welding knowledge, on the physics of scrap metal, on the idea that American steel and Chicago grit were stronger than German armor. He kissed the shell, a prayer to the god of mechanics. He dropped it. He dove flat into the snow. The recoil was so violent it cracked the frozen ground beneath the base plate. The ice jacket fractured, a spiderweb of cracks shooting through the frozen mud, but the wire held. The tube screamed but didn't shatter. The shell soared, higher and faster than any 60mm round had any right to fly. It hung in the air for an eternity. 600 yards away, the Panzer IV was preparing to fire for effect. The commander had the hatch open, confident in his distance. The mortar shell didn't hit the tank directly. It didn't need to. It landed 10 feet behind the engine block, on the hard-packed ice of the road. Because of the extra velocity, it didn't bury itself. It detonated on impact. The blast wave blew the tank's external fuel stores. A fireball erupted, lighting up the night like a second sun. The tank didn't explode, but the shockwave and the fire blinded the crew. The vehicle lurched, through a track in panic, and slid sideways into a ditch, useless. Silence returned to the Bois Jacques. Finch lay in the snow, his ears ringing, smoke drifting from the cracked ice on the mortar tube. He checked his hands, 10 fingers. He checked the tube. It was still standing. Slowly, the men of the platoon began to cheer. It wasn't a parade cheer, it was a guttural, primal sound of relief. They slapped Finch on the back, their fear momentarily replaced by awe. But Lieutenant Thorne didn't cheer. He stood at the edge of the pit, looking at the smoking weapon and then at Finch. His face was a mask of conflict. He had just witnessed a soldier violate every safety protocol in the book and achieve a result that the book said was impossible. He knew that if he reported this, Finch would go to prison. He also knew that without Finch, he would be dead. "Sergeant," Thorne said, his voice trembling slightly. The cheering died down. The men looked at the officer, ready to mutiny if he tried to arrest Finch. "Sir?" Finch stood up, wiping soot from his face. Thorne looked at the burning tank in the distance. He swallowed hard. That was effective fire. However, the weapon appears damaged. We will log it as combat stress. Carry on." Thorne turned and walked back to the CP, disappearing into the dark. He hadn't authorized it, but he hadn't stopped it. It was the first crack in his armor. Finch looked at Vance. Vance was grinning, a cigarette hanging from his lip. "Combat stress," Vance chuckled. "That's one word for it." "We're not done," Finch said, looking at the cracked ice jacket. "The wire held, but the ice is compromised. We need more water, and we need more wire. They'll be back in the morning." As the adrenaline faded, the cold rushed back in, sharper than before. But something had changed. They weren't just victims waiting to freeze or die anymore. They had bitten back. Finch sat down in the foxhole, his hands shaking as the adrenaline crash hit him. He looked at the spot where Danny O'Malley had died, "One for you, kid," he whispered. "One for you." But as he looked at the remaining shells, he realized they were running low on the scavenged German powder, and the file he was using to weaken the fuses was getting dull. The Germans would adapt. They would realize it wasn't artillery support, but a single, desperate mortar crew. And when they came tomorrow, they wouldn't just bring one tank, they would bring the whole division. What would you do if the rules meant losing everything? Sometimes doing the right thing means breaking the code. Artie Finch is risking a court-martial to keep his men alive, proving that sometimes human ingenuity matters more than a rulebook. I want to hear from you. Have you ever been in a situation where you had to ignore the official way of doing things to solve a real problem? Maybe at work or in a crisis. Drop a comment below and tell me your story of field expedience. And if you want to see how this impossible stand ends, make sure you're subscribed. The morning of December 23rd did not bring the sun. It brought a silence that was louder than the shelling. The temperature had stabilized at an ungodly 10 degrees below zero. In the foxhole, Artie Finch sat staring at the M2 mortar. It was no longer a weapon, it was a ruin. The ice jacket, once a solid block of frozen reinforcements, had cracked and refrozen into a jagged, ugly scar of mud and wire. The repeated stress of the overcharged rounds had warped the baseplate, driving it almost 2 feet into the frozen earth. Finch's hands were useless claws. He had taken his gloves off to file the shear wires on the last batch of shells, and the metal had leached the heat straight out of his blood. The tips of his fingers were black. He knew, with the detached logic of a mechanic assessing a broken piston, that he would likely lose them, but he didn't care. He was looking at the tree line. "They're late," Corporal Vance rasped. Vance looked like a corpse that had forgotten to lie down. His eyes were sunken pits of exhaustion. "They aren't late," Finch whispered, his voice cracking from dehydration. "They're waiting for the fog to lift. They want us to see what's coming." Lieutenant Thorne slid into the pit. The crisp, by-the-book officer from Act 1 was gone. In his place was a man whose uniform was stained with mud and oil, whose helmet was dented, and whose eyes held the haunted, 1,000-yard stare of a veteran. He carried a crate of standard ammunition, the useless kind. "We're out of the German powder," Thorne said quietly. "This is all we have left, standard charges, and I found this." Thorne handed Finch a bottle of cognac. It was half empty, scavenged from a bombed-out farmhouse. "Anti-freeze," Thorne said, a ghost of a smile touching his cracked lips. Finch took a swig. The alcohol burned like gasoline, momentarily stunning the cold in his chest. He passed it to Vance. "If they come with armor again, we're done," Finch said, looking at the warped tube. "She won't take another supercharge. The barrel is ovaling. One more high-pressure round, and it splits right down the seam. We'll be eating shrapnel." Thorne looked at the weapon that had violated every regulation he had ever memorized. He reached out and touched the jagged wire binding. "It held the line for 2 days, Sergeant. It did its job." "Machines don't get medals for dying, Lieutenant," Finch muttered. At 09:45 hours, the wind shifted. For the first time in a week, the heavy, oppressive blanket of grey cloud began to tear. Shafts of brilliant, blinding sunlight stabbed down through the gloom, illuminating the devastation of the Bois Jacques. The snow was no longer white. It was grey with ash and speckled with the frozen debris of war. And with the light came the end. A bugle didn't sound. There was no dramatic speech. The German line simply surged forward. This wasn't a probe. This was a wave. Hundreds of infantrymen in white camouflage rose from the snow, supported not by tanks, but by self-propelled guns, low, ugly tracked vehicles that could blast a foxhole apart from 1,000 yards. "Here we go," Vance whispered. He grabbed his rifle. "Load the mortar," Finch screamed, forcing his frozen hands to move. "It's useless," Vance yelled back. "No extra charge, no range." "Load it," Finch roared. "Drop it short. We hit the first wave." Vance grabbed a standard round. He dropped it. Thunk! Whoosh! The round landed 200 yards out. A muffled thud. No explosion. The snow swallowed it. "God damn it!" Finch slammed his fist against the frozen dirt. The physics hadn't changed. The standard rounds were still failing. The Germans were closing in. 300 yards, 200 yards. The sound of their boots crunching on the snow was audible now, a terrifying, rhythmic percussion. The American riflemen on the line opened up, the sharp cracks of M1 Garens filling the air, but there were too many targets. Thorne was firing his sidearm, a futile gesture against the tide. Fall back to the secondary line. Prepare to fix bayonets." "No!" Finch looked at the crate of duds. He looked at the last remaining hair trigger round they had prepared, the one with the filed wire but no extra propellant. "Vance, the hair trigger. It won't reach them," Vance shouted, firing his rifle. "I'm not aiming at them." Finch grabbed the round. He adjusted the bipod, cranking the elevation almost vertical. "Artie, what are you doing?" Vance stopped firing. "I'm aiming at the trees directly above us," Finch said, his eyes wild. "We bring the forest down on the road." "You'll kill us," Thorne yelled. "We're already dead, Lieutenant." Finch dropped the round. Thunk. The shell went almost straight up. It didn't arc out toward the enemy. It climbed 80 yards into the air, stalled and fell backward, plunging down toward the canopy of pines directly in front of their foxhole, less than 50 yards away. The hair trigger fuse struck a thick branch 40 feet off the ground. The explosion was deafeningly close. It didn't send shrapnel into the Germans. It snapped the trunk of a massive ancient pine tree. The tree, heavy with snow and ice, groaned and toppled forward, crashing down across the logging road with the weight of a freight train. It landed squarely in the path of the lead self-propelled gun. The vehicle slammed into the timber, its tracks spinning helplessly against the obstacle. The infantry behind it bunched up, stalled by the sudden blockage. "It bought us a minute," Finch yelled. "Grenades! Throw everything you've got!" But a minute wasn't enough. The Germans were swarming around the fallen tree. They were 80 yards away. Finch could see their faces. He drew his trench knife. He had no rounds left. The mortar was empty. The rifles were clicking dry. Finch looked at Thorne. The officer was reloading his pistol with shaking hands. He looked at Vance, who was fixing a bayonet to his rifle. "It was an honor, boys," Finch said softly. And then the sky tore open. It started as a low rumble, felt in the chest before it was heard. Then it became a roar, a mechanical scream that drowned out the gunfire. Finch looked up. Through the break in the clouds, a shape descended. It was silver, gleaming in the sunlight. It had a red nose and broad, flat wings. A P-47 Thunderbolt. "Air support!" Thorne screamed, his voice cracking. "Patton sent the Air Force." The fighter plane didn't just fly over. It dove. It came down like the wrath of God, its 850 caliber machine guns tearing the earth apart. Tracers rained down on the German line, turning the snow into a cauldron of steam and debris. Behind the Thunderbolt came another, and then the most beautiful sight Artie Finch had ever seen. C-47 transport planes lumbering low over the drop zone. Parachutes bloomed against the blue sky. Red parachutes for ammo, blue for food, yellow for medical supplies. It was a rain of salvation. The German advance didn't just stall, it evaporated. Exposed in the open sunlight, they were sitting ducks for the American air power. The self-propelled gun that Finch had blocked with the tree exploded as a bomb from a P-47 found its mark. In the foxhole, the men didn't cheer. They just collapsed. Vance slid down the mud wall, weeping openly. Thorne dropped his pistol and put his head in his hands. Finch stood there, watching the planes. He felt the tears freezing on his cheeks. He looked down at his hands, blackened, bleeding, ruined. He looked at the M2 mortar. The tube had finally split. The last round, the vertical shot had cracked the steel. The ice jacket had melted away, leaving only a muddy, wired mess. That evening, the relief column from General Patton's Third Army broke through the southern perimeter. Tanks, real tanks, rolled into Bastogne. The siege was broken. Finch sat by a fire that night, finally feeling the pain of the thaw returning to his limbs. A medic was bandaging his hands. He would keep his fingers, but the nerve damage would be permanent. He would never hold a welding torch with the same steadiness again. Lieutenant Thorne approached him. He was holding a clipboard, an official after-action report. He sat down next to Finch. "I have to file the report on the equipment loss," Thorne said. He looked at the fire. "Standard procedure requires me to explain why a 60mm mortar tube was destroyed." Finch didn't look up. "Tell them I used the wrong charge. Tell them I was incompetent." "I don't care, Lieutenant, just don't tell them about the file." Thorne looked at the clipboard. He took a pen and wrote a single sentence. "Weapon destroyed by enemy fire during defensive operations." He signed it. Then he ripped the page out of the clipboard and tossed it into the fire. He watched it burn, the paper curling into ash. "There was no modification, Sergeant," Thorne said softly. "The weapon performed according to manual specifications. You simply aimed it well." Finch looked at the officer. For the first time, there was no rank between them, just the shared secret of survival. "Thank you, sir," Finch said. "Don't thank me, Artie." Thorne stood up, dusting off his pants. "Get some sleep. We move out for Foy in the morning." Finch watched him walk away. He looked down at his hands. The war didn't end that night. It went on for another 5 months. Finch fought in the Rhineland, in the Ruhr Pocket, all the way to Berchtesgaden. But he never modified a weapon again. He never talked about the ice-jacketed mortar. When he returned to Chicago in 1945, he went back to the scrapyard. He became the foreman again. He married, had 2 daughters, and lived a quiet life. When people asked about the war, he told them it was cold, that was all. He died in 1988. At his funeral, there were no generals, no historians, just his family and a few old men from the neighborhood. But in the back of the church, an elderly man in a wheelchair sat quietly. It was Julian Thorne. He didn't speak to the family. He didn't make a scene. He just watched the coffin, his hand resting on a cane. As the pallbearers carried Artie Finch out, Thorne whispered 3 words that nobody else heard. "Hold the line." Finch's name never appeared in a military textbook. The ice jacket technique was never taught at West Point. The innovation that saved 12 men in a frozen hole in Belgium was buried under the snow of history, just like the shell casings they left behind. Because that's the truth about war. The brilliance that saves lives isn't found in the manuals written by men in warm offices. It's found in the frozen, desperate hands of men like Artie Finch, who look at the impossible and decide to fix it with a file and a piece of wire. They don't do it for the glory. They do it because the guy next to them is shivering, and that's enough.